Chapter 25 of Paul the Dauntless. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Leeson. Paul the Dauntless by Basil Joseph Mathews. Chapter 25. Lone on the land and homeless on the water. Paul lived on in Corinth for many days after Gallio had driven the Jews from his judgment seat. He worked there through all the blazing summer when the hills beyond the gulf shimmered in a blue haze. He saw the men and women go out to gather the grapes from the vineyards on the hillside, to reap the yellow harvest of the plain, and to garner the olives and citrons from the groves of the isthmus. He stayed on through the winter, when the snow-covered mountains of Hellas were outlined in white against the grey sky, till spring came again, and all the plain was gleaming with yellow, red, and blue anemones, and the black oxen dragged the wooden ploughs through the brown soil to break it up for the sowing. Through all that time, the more he thought about Gallio's judgment that he, Paul, the Jew and Roman citizen, had the right to preach as he would and where he would in the Roman Empire, the greater seemed the meaning of the decision. For it meant that, so long as he did not teach men to rebel against the power of the Emperor Claudius, Paul could carry his adventure into Rome itself. Priscilla, whose name suggests that she was a Roman lady of high standing, and Aquila, her Jewish husband, would fill Paul's mind with their remembrances of the greatness of Rome, the queen of cities, the mistress of the world, set upon her 7 hills by the yellow Tiber. The thought of Rome never left Paul's mind from that time onward. Paul had now drawn together in Corinth men and women, with their sons and daughters, into a house church. Among his friends who worshipped together with him were Titius Justus, the Roman, and Crispus, Erastus, a great man who was treasurer of the city of Corinth, and Achaeus, Fortunatus, Gaius, and Chloe with her household. It may even be that Sosthenes, who had been his enemy in dragging him before Gallio, the new leader of the synagogue, had joined him. For a few years later, at the beginning of his first letter to the Christians at Corinth, Paul says that a Sosthenes from Corinth was actually with him when he wrote it. Paul now felt that, having as a wise master builder laid firm foundations at Corinth, he must go forward with his work in other places. When the springtime came, and even before the ships hoisted their brown sails and had begun to cross the Great Sea, Paul bestirred himself to go back to Antioch in Syria, the place that had first sent him out on his journeys. But he went back by a route on which he had never travelled before, and he started with new companions. Aquila and Priscilla decided to cross with him over the Aegean Sea to Ephesus. To these Roman travellers this did not seem, as it does to us, like sailing from Europe to Asia, for Ephesus was almost as Greek as Corinth, and it seemed nearer to Athens than did many inland cities among the hills of Greece itself. All the shores and islands of the Aegean were one to the Greek. All the harbours of Greece, except one, look out over the Aegean Sea, so that really Troas, Ephesus, and Smyrna were like cousins to Athens and Philippi and Thessalonica. Paul, with Aquila and Priscilla, having said a long good-bye in Justus's house, gathered their goods and set off down the road under the shadow of the Acro-Corinth hill to Cenchrea. Paul's luggage was always light, his cloak and staff, his wallet for food, and perhaps a few rolls of manuscript tucked into his tunic. Aquila and Priscilla would have their tools, and some rolls of goat's hair and camel hair canvas, and rope for tent making. They would stay a night at the house of Phoebe at Cenchrea, for Paul says that she often tended him. Taking their passage next dawn on a sailing ship for Ephesus, they saw the hills of Greece slip past them, and the boat nosed her way out past the island of Salamis toward the open sea. With no compass to steer by, and sailing in a sea of rocky islands, and especially so early in the spring, the ship would be bound to look for anchorage under the lee of an island before sundown each day, and hoist sail at dawn to make the most of each day's light. So for day after day they sailed, till about the 6th day they would sight the island of Samos, and in an hour or so, with sails furled and sweeps out, were threading the winding channel of the river Castor, and the canal toward the harbour of Ephesus. Swinging round under the lee of the fortified hill that guarded the port, they found themselves in a landlocked harbour busy with all the life of spring. Paul went ashore, and from the stone pier walked up the portway that ran, straight as a dart, between its marble pillars from the harbour to the heart of the city. There the theatre of Ephesus, cut out of the mountainside, and the busy market-place faced him. As he went round by the theatre, through the Magnesian gate, he saw on the plain, within groves of trees, that seventh wonder of the world, the temple of Artemis of the Ephesians, rising all one glory of golden carving and white marble, with cool shadows where the worshippers went in under the great roof to lay their gifts on the altars. Turning back, he went with Priscilla and Aquila to the quarter of the city where the Jews lived. On the Sabbath he walked with them to a building where no images of gods could be found, where, indeed, the only carving was of a bunch of grapes and vine leaves over the entrance. He entered the cool darkness of the synagogue and spoke with the people, as he was wont to do, of the coming at long last of the promised Prince, the Messiah. They leaned forward as he spoke and drank in his words eagerly. His good news seems too wonderful to be true. If what Paul said was true, all ought to hear it. If false, his mouth ought to be stopped. They wished to know more. "Stay with us and tell us more," they pleaded. "No," replied Paul, "I must hasten to the feast at Jerusalem. I will come again to you, if God wills." The pilgrim ships were now hasting on their voyages from all parts of the Great Sea to Caesarea, which was used as a port for travellers to and from Jerusalem. So Paul went down to the portway again to the harbour, and saying farewell to Aquila and Priscilla and to his new-found friends in Ephesus, he went aboard a ship which swept down to the open sea for the long sail of over 600 miles. In those times, without the mariner's compass, sea captains did not like to lose sight of land, and especially in those early spring days in the Aegean Sea, when storms might leap upon them from the north and the clouds would hide the sun. So the ship in which Paul sailed would hug the coast, leaving Patmos to starboard, running past Miletus and through the strait between Cos and the gulf where Halicarnassus lay. They would surely run into the great harbour at Rhodes, and then come past the mountains of Lycia, and taking courage in both hands, sail southeast past Paphos in Cyprus, where Paul had sailed with Barnabas those years gone by. The ship's deck was crowded with pilgrims with their rolled-up mat-beds, their staves and cloaks, their water bottles and wallets stuffed with raisins and cheese and flat bread. Old men were there taking their last long journey to the city on its hills, and boys who would remind Paul of the day when he had started with his father on his first pilgrimage to Jerusalem. At last the towers of Caesarea and the sturdy sickle-shaped breakwater hove in sight. The great sail was furled and the sweeps put out to row the ship into the harbour. Once ashore, Paul lost no time in joining the throngs of pilgrims who strode out past the stadium and theatre of Caesarea and up the Roman road which breasted the low hills and climbed the Judean heights. Then the golden pinnacles of the temple broke the skyline. Paul's sandals again trod the pavements of the city where he had trained at the feet of Gamaliel, that marvellous brain which now had proclaimed the good news of the risen Christ in a score of cities from Antioch to Corinth, across 1,000 miles of the Roman Empire. Paul joined with his friends in the Passover feast, but the narrowness of the Christian brethren in Jerusalem jarred terribly on his spirit. Even now they could not all see that Christ had come with a message for all men and all nations, a salvation that broke through the myriad details of the law to that flaming higher law of love which was freedom indeed. Paul turned his back on Jerusalem and sped northward to Antioch, probably by sea from Caesarea to Seleucia. It must have refreshed him to meet again at Antioch the old friends who had sent him out to run his great adventurous course across the seas and in the cities of the Roman Empire. They too would sit around him, Black Simeon, Lucius from Cyrene, Manaen and the others, with eyes shining with alternate joy and sadness, as he told the great story of his adventures and those of Silas and Timothy. How they listened to the varied tale of the call to Macedonia, the beating and the prison in Philippi, and then the earthquake and the coming of the Roman praetors to take them by the hand and beg them to leave, the long tramp over the Egnatian Way, with the riot in Thessalonica and the threatenings at Beroea, the sailing to Athens, where the learned philosophers jeered, though Dionysius and Damaris stayed to listen and to worship, and then the great days in Corinth. Surely the Antiochian brethren could not help smiling as they heard how Sosthenes, who had dragged Paul before Gallio, was himself beaten by the people. Yet they would love still more to hear Paul say that Sosthenes himself had, after all, entered the way of salvation. The mother church at Antioch had sent Paul out on 2 great missionary journeys, each stranger and more wonderful than they had imagined in their wildest dreams. There had been built, through the splendid quest of Paul and his companions, outposts of the faith, churches garrisoned by brave Christians who held the line in the great strategic centers halfway across the Roman Empire. From Antioch the line now stretched across the Syrian mountains of Amanus, over the Cilician plain and through the Cilician gates to the cities beyond Taurus, Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch in Pisidia, down to Ephesus, and across the Hellespont to Philippi, Thessalonica, Beroea, and even to Athens and Corinth. The hearts of the friends of Paul at Antioch would burn within them as they listened to the story and looked into the brown face of their dauntless pioneer. He would be sure to share with them his plans for the future. Of these we know that he had 2 on which his heart was at this time specially set. He was afraid that the churches in cities across the empire might grow narrow and be simply interested in their own little affairs. So his first plan was to give them a work to do for other people far away from themselves. He meant to set them all to collect money for the help of the poor who were in Jerusalem. This would do great good to the churches who gave the money, by widening their outlook, giving them a more imperial vision, and the feeling that they belonged to a great church which embraced all who held the faith in the unity of the Spirit. It would also greatly stir the hearts of the people in Jerusalem, who were in danger of feeling that the far-off churches were hardly truly Christian, to receive a gift from those in the far-flung battle line of Paul's missionary adventure. That was the first plan in the far-seeing brain of Paul, who was a statesman, a wise master-builder, as well as an heroic pioneer. Another great ambition of Paul at this time, one that he knew might cost him his life, as indeed it did, was to carry his gospel into the very heart of the Roman Empire, that is, to occupy the very center of the world of his day, Rome. To bring into being a church that felt itself to be one throughout the whole empire, and with a center at the capital of the empire itself, that was the daring, the tremendous scheme of the wise and undaunted master builder. It was now summer. Paul wished to carry out part of his first plan before winter set in, and at the same time to fulfill his promise to his friends at Ephesus. He therefore left Antioch and went out once more across the Orontes, with his feet on the open road and his face toward the mountain heights. Simeon and some of the others would be sure to go out the first miles of the road with him. But as the men of Antioch waved their farewells to Paul and took their last look at the sturdy figure as he rode his ass along the paved way, they would not know that they would never look on him again. From dawn to dark he rode, leaving the great Mount Sulpius behind him, passing now the shore of a lovely lake and there a stream running down from the Amanus mountains. He would talk by the wayside with the leaders of the camel caravans that swung along the great road, up the now deepening gorges of the mountains, and through the dark shadows of the Syrian gates, the paths that led into his own native Cilician plain. Along the great road — it was the ancient road down which Alexander the Great himself had come with his armies — Paul travelled till he rode across that bridge from which as a boy he had watched the boats go down to the harbour of Tarsus. Here, and among the other churches of the plains, he spoke to the Christian folk, strengthening their courage and helping them to meet the arguments of their enemies. He went along the old streets down which he had run as a boy to school, and would see the booth where he had sat at the loom and had thrust his first needles through the goat's hair tent canvas. Then Paul turned his back on Tarsus and went out northward across the plain to the Taurus mountains. As the traveller rested the ass at the foothills and gazed back down the road to the roofs and orchards of Tarsus, and saw the silver ribbon of the river curving down to the harbour, he took his last look at that no mean city, whose chief glory after all is not that Alexander the Great bathed in its river, or that Antony entertained Cleopatra in its palace, or that Athenodorus taught in its university, but that Paul himself was born within its walls. So Paul passed forever from that plain up the Cilician Pass, where the tinkle of the camel bells and the music of the mountain stream filled the grey gorges. Paul climbed up and on by the Roman post road till he passed through the shadow of the Cilician gates, out on to the high tableland of Cappadocia. He came out on to the dry road on which the summer sun shimmered, and the very camels were glad to get out of the rays of the noonday under the shelter of a wayside inn. He reached Derbe, going in by the gate through which some 3 years earlier he and Silas had entered. Here, as everywhere on this journey, he told the Christian folk of the needs of the poor of the church in Jerusalem, and they promised their gifts. So he passed from Derbe at dawn, when the sun threw the long shadow of the mountain of black rock along the path that he was to follow up the low hills. Through the day he walked till he reached the bridge near which the oxen quenched their thirst at sunset in the shallow stream that ran over its bed round the Acrolystra. At Lystra, we can well believe, Grandmother Lois and her daughter Eunice would want to know all the adventures that had fallen to their boy Timothy. They would be proud to hear how he helped Paul, carrying his cloak, writing his letters and bearing them to far-off cities, facing the scourge and the rods, and the peril of sea and land for Paul's sake and for the gospel. Starting from Lystra, perhaps before dawn, to get as much journeying as possible done before the midsummer sun was high in the heavens, Paul took the caravan road over the low ridge of hill country and down to where the gushing river from the mountain watered the orchards and cleansed the homes of Iconium. The orchard farmers of Iconium would be busy scaring the birds from the growing fruit, in the days when Paul cheered the church there with stories of the wonderful victories their Lord had won in the cities of East and West. So he passed on his unresting travel, and though the grey was now beginning to tinge Paul's beard and his hair, and the fiery sun made journeying a toil, and though friends desired him to stay and warned him how the brigands of the Pisidian mountains lay in wait ahead, Paul never stayed his course. The fire of his passion for the Christ whom he had met on that blazing day on the road to Damascus so many years ago burned on him always. Let no man think that sudden in a minute all is accomplished and the work is done. Though with thine earliest dawn thou shouldst begin it, scarce were it ended in thy setting sun. Paul could, never at even, pillowed on a pleasure, sleep with the wings of aspiration furled. So with staff and water bottle and mat bed, and with his satchel stuffed with fruits and cheese and bread, he got out on to the road again, till he once more joined in the new military Roman road that led him to Pisidian Antioch, where the aqueduct brought the water from the mountains in whose gorges the robbers hid. Paul's friends there would remember how Barnabas and he had first come to them from the fever-stricken Pamphylian plain 5 years before, and they would be full of joy at seeing him now for the third, although it was the last, visit among them. We do not know what he said to them, but he would be likely to say things as he was leaving them, like those great words that he wrote to these churches of Galatia later on. "Brothers, you were called to be free. Only do not make your freedom an opening for the flesh, but serve one another in love. For the entire law is summed up in one word: you must love your neighbor as yourself. Whereas, if you snap at each other and prey upon each other, take care in case you destroy one another. I mean, lead the life of the Spirit. Then you will never satisfy the passions of the flesh. The harvest of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, good temper, kindliness, generosity, fidelity, gentleness, self-control. Make no mistake, a man will reap just what he sows. He who sows for his flesh will reap destruction from the flesh, and he who sows for the Spirit will reap life eternal from the Spirit." Never let us grow tired of doing what is right, for if we do not faint, we shall reap our harvest at the proper season." Paul's friends would go with him through the western gate with the dawn at their backs, as he set out on the last great part, and in some ways the most dangerous part, of this journey. At the beginning his road lay on the track that Timothy and Silas had trodden with him 3 years earlier. He was on the great Roman road. Down from the northeast and across this Roman road came the trade road, along which the camels brought the fruits and silks of the plateau to Ephesus or the Aegean coast. Paul was going to Ephesus, but he did not take this safer caravan route with its regular inns and companionship. He struck ahead on the hillier and more dangerous road, where fewer men went, and he travelled straight for Ephesus. Up and down the hills and dales of Asia he passed, gradually dropping from the tableland to the river valleys, crossing the streams that ran from the hills to the Meander River, then over the moorland to the upper waters of the Caistor. Down the valleys of the Caistor from highland to lowland he rode, only drawing bridle for needed rest and shelter at noontide and at night. For the autumn was drawing on, the vineyards were purple with grapes, and the olives hung thick on the trees. The cries of the harvesters sounded on the hillsides, and the laughter of the maidens as they trod the grapes with their bare feet in the winepress. At last one day, as Paul came round a curve in a valley, he felt a fresh breeze on his cheek, and saw a blue gleam on the horizon. The word of the soldiers of Greece when they saw the Euxine would leap to his lips: "Thalassa, Thalassa, the sea, the sea." Before him, like a map unrolled, lay the mouth of the Caistor, the shining marble temples and theatre and stadium of Ephesus, and on the edge the harbour with its still masts and crowded shipping. Only that very spring he had sailed from that harbour out into the Great Sea, and had braved the storms of March to worship at Jerusalem at the feast. He had gone over mountain pass and plain and plateau, had seen 1,000 faces lighten at his coming, and had quickened to new courage hearts that were failing in facing hard tasks. Now he had to face the battle afresh in this new city, but he did not quail or tire. Yes, without cheer of mother or of daughter, yes, without stay of father or of son, lone on the land and homeless on the water, pass I in patience till the work is done. His pace would quicken, and as he entered the great Smyrna gate of Ephesus he would look eagerly for the familiar faces of Aquila and Priscilla. End of chapter 25.